Hi students, this is the recording for lesson 4.01 and we're going to be talking about ecosystems. So here's a general overview of what we'll be talking about. An ecosystem is made up of a community of organisms, right? Remember, organisms are living things and the physical features of their environment. Okay, so we have a community of organisms or living things, so not just one species, but many different species living together, as well as all of the physical features of where they live. Okay, so the living things would be all the organisms, and then we have other non-living things which we're going to call abiotic, such as temperature, sunlight, and rainfall. So those two things together are what we're going to call an ecosystem. Okay, so a community of organism, again, not just one, but many different types of species, and its abiotic factors, abiotic meaning non-living. Remember, bio means life, a means without, so without life or non-living. Those two things is what is going to make up an ecosystem. Okay, so we have an example right here. So we have a Gila monster, and it lives in a desert, right? And so we see that it has a very specific habitat in which it lives, a very specific ecosystem. So some of the living things you can see here would be like the cacti, right? The Gila monster itself, whereas the non-living things would be things like heat and scant rainfall, right? Heat and the fact that it doesn't rain very much. Those are also components of the Gila monster's ecosystem. So again, together, abiotic plus biotic make up an ecosystem. Okay, so let's go into what abiotic factors are. So we kind of broke down what abiotic meant. Bio meaning life, a meaning without. So without life, non-living factors. And they are present in every single ecosystem. So what are some examples of some abiotic factors? We can have things like heat or sunlight. We can have things like water, oxygen, rocks, etc. These are all abiotic factors, things that are non-living but are present in an ecosystem. Just because they're not living, that doesn't mean that they don't interact with living organisms. For example, water is a very important molecule that we need in order to survive, and so is oxygen. So again, just because they're not living, that does not mean that they're not crucial for survival. So when we look at when we look at different ecosystems, we kind of define them because they have different biotic and abiotic factors. If an ecosystem is how biotic and abiotic factors interact, if we have different types of biotic and different types of abiotic factors, then that's how we can kind of define the different types of ecosystems. So for example, if we have a biotic factor like a penguin, we wouldn't find it living in a rainforest, right? Because a rainforest does not have the adequate biotic and abiotic factors needed for a penguin to survive. The same thing about a tiger living in the Arctic or a shark living in a desert. Again, an organism that lives in a specific ecosystem relies on the biotic and abiotic factors that exist in that specific ecosystem. And really, when we're talking about the environment and the habitat of these organisms, abiotic factors really play a huge role because abiotic factors really determines like the temperature, right? How much rainfall there is. etc. And again, these two things are extremely important in determining whether an organism will be able to survive in a specific ecosystem. So here we have a climate map, and you can see there are many different types of climates, but you can see below here, and based on the color shading, you can see that the different types of climates that exist on Earth. Let's go over a couple of them. So we see here, here we would see a type of tropical rainy climate, and you see that the types of organisms would be green and lush. Up here we would see more of a polar climate, so we see lots of snow and also organisms adapted to that climate, such as polar bears. Here in the western region of Africa, we see that we have a dry climate, a climate that would be suited for animals like camels that don't require as much water. Over here in Asia, we see again another tropical rainy type of environment where a panda bear would flourish. So not only do ecosystems vary in climate, but they also vary in size. Okay, so it gets kind of tricky here because ecosystems, it's kind of hard to define what exactly an ecosystem is and what the boundaries of each ecosystem are. And scientists actually do this in very different ways. So, for example, an ecosystem can be as broad or big as an entire landscape or as small as a little tide pool. So if you were to see here, we could, some scientists would say that this entire thing right here, right, would be one ecosystem. But if we compared it to a tide pool, which this is obviously zoomed in very closely, we can also consider this an ecosystem itself. We can think of a rotting cactus, which is obviously not that big, or even something as big as a river. Each of those can also be an ecosystem. So again, very difficult to define exactly what the boundaries are of certain ecosystems. They can be either very big or very small. And as if it wasn't complicated enough, ecosystems can actually be found within ecosystems. The Okefenokee swamp in Georgia is a great example of this. So the actual swamp is 700 square miles, which is huge. And we can consider the entire swamp to be an ecosystem. It has biotic factors such as plants, animals, and microorganisms. And it also has abiotic factors like light and temperature and different chemical makeup of the water. But we can also look within the swamp and we can see even smaller ecosystems within that larger ecosystem. So if we were to look in a smaller section of the swamp, we would see like clumps of reeds or groups of aquatic plants. All of these could be smaller ecosystems. Like we can have on clumps of reeds, there could be microorganisms on there growing. We can have specific abiotic and biotic factors living in those specific places as well. And so, again, even within a huge ecosystem, like a huge swamp, we can find smaller ones, smaller ecosystems living within there as well. So the kind of the takeaway from this is that the boundaries of an ecosystem is really fluid. As long as you have abiotic and biotic factors interacting with one another with a community of organisms, we can define that as an ecosystem. We can even find ecosystems within our body. So some example would be like our skin right here. There are definitely microorganisms that help protect your skin. And there are also bacteria found in your mouth. And I'm sure a lot of you guys know that our mouth isn't the cleanest place in the world. I'm sure all of you guys, when you wake up, you feel that fuzzy coating that you feel on your teeth, and it's actually called biofilm. And that biofilm is actually made up of bacteria, which is why it's so important for you to brush your teeth in the morning. And that bacteria just grows really well in your mouth. It has a ideal temperature and pH conditions. Those are both abiotic factors that make it a perfect ecosystem for that bacteria to live in. Another place where we can find ecosystems in the human body is our digestive system. Our digestive system has many nutrients and vitamins, which would be considered abiotic factors, but we also have bacteria that live in there, which would be the biotic factors. Another important aspect of ecosystems for you to realize is that ecosystems don't just exist independently. They definitely are codependent on one another. No ecosystem is isolated on its own. Each ecosystem will be in some ways connected to another. So here's some examples why. Organisms may sometimes move from from one ecosystem to another. Um, Something that happens in one ecosystem, like a weather event, could affect a nearby ecosystem. For example, if there's a snowy winter in the mountains, then the valley ecosystem below will experience higher than usual river levels in the springtime as the snow melts. So although the organisms may not directly interact with one another, definitely, especially their abiotic factors, could end up affecting each other in the long run. So every ecosystem doesn't stay the same forever. There are definitely changes, and specifically changes in the abiotic factors. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about climate change and how that's a really hot topic right now. For example, scientists suggest that the Earth's climate is getting warmer and warmer, and that's dangerous because species that thrive in cooler conditions will need to migrate northward and may even go extinct in the southern end of the range. So obviously that's going to change the makeup of that ecosystem. Another abiotic factor that could change are the carbon dioxide levels. So the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere may also be increasing. And so what that can cause is for oceans to take up more of the gas. When oceans take up more of the carbon dioxide, what ends up happening is it makes the ocean more acidic. And since the ocean is definitely a habitat for so many different species, what can happen is it can end up being really harmful to specific animals like clams, mussels, and scallops, or any other organisms that live in the ocean. So the point is that ecosystems change in response to many factors. It could be changes with biotic or abiotic factors. So here's a summary of what we went over in this lesson. The organisms, which are the biotic factors, depend on one another, but they also depend on their abiotic factors as well, like sunlight, water, and temperature. Changes in any of those abiotic factors can really affect the organisms there either positively or negatively. Remember that scientists define the ecosystems in many different ways. It can be really large or it can be really small, and there isn't a specific method that all scientists use in order to define the boundaries of ecosystems. So some important vocabulary that we went over in this lesson are biotic factors, and remember those are things that are related to living organisms. Abiotic factors that relate to non-biological factors or non-living factors. And then we have ecosystem where we defined it as a community or group of organisms, so it's going to be multiple species living and interacting with each other and their environment. And their environment is going to include the abiotic factors, which is the non-living.